Well, welcome everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started. We are very excited that you are joining us for this month's webinar on shared ownership, where we'll focus on scaling the development of worker-owned cooperatives. And for those of you who are new to BALLE, we are the fastest growing business alliance of value-aligned entrepreneurs, business networks, and local economy funders in North America. BALLE seeks to create real prosperity by connecting leaders, spreading solutions that work, and driving investment toward local economies. My name is Leslie Lindo, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement for BALLE. And today I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Dubb, who will be moderating this discussion, and Hillary Abell and Andrew Del Monte. And they will be going deep into the work they're doing to incubate worker co-ops. We will have 45 minutes of the moderated session, and then it will open up to questions from the audience. To ask a question, please click the chat icon at the bottom right corner of your screen, and you can type your questions into the chat box at any time during the discussion. In the last 10 minutes, Steve will select questions from the chat box to be posed to our speakers. If you're unable to see the video of the speakers, please click the icon that represents heads of people. The public webinar will close at 1 p.m. Pacific time, and BALLE Champion members are invited to remain in the room for a 30-minute private Q&A with the speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Steve Dubb. Steve Dubb is the Senior Fellow and Director of Special Projects at the Democracy Collaborative and has been with the Collaborative since 2004. He has written a number of books and studies on community wealth building and has participated in a wide range of products, including working with Ted Howard to help develop the Evergreen Cooperatives Initiative in Cleveland, Ohio, as well as helping develop community wealth building strategies in close to a dozen U.S. cities. Steve is also part of the Democracy Collaborative's Learning Action Lab team that, with the support of the Northwest Area Foundation, is partnering with Native American organizations in 4 communities to develop employee-owned businesses and social enterprises. Thank you so much, and welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Leslie, for that kind introduction. And so I thought I'd start the discussion just with a little bit of information about cooperatives for those in the BALLE audience that may or may not be fully familiar with them, and then we'll introduce our panelists and have a lively discussion from there. Some basic information about cooperatives is that they're basically member-owned businesses that are one member, one vote. And they're quite common both in the United States and internationally. So 1 billion people worldwide are members of cooperatives. Within the United States, over 100 million are, and they come in different varieties. So we're going to be talking about worker co-ops today, but they're more prevalent are consumer co-ops, including credit unions, and another example of a large consumer co-op is REI. You have producer co-ops, and about 30% of produce that you'll find on your grocery shelves is actually produced by a cooperative. And you also have purchasing co-ops like Ace Hardware Store, where the small business owners collectively purchase supplies as well as marketing services. And the key thing that's similar with all co-ops is the principle of one member, one vote, open membership, a commitment to education, a commitment to community, and a commitment to cooperation among cooperatives in building a prosperous local economy. And just in terms of statistics, there's about $500 billion in annual sales by cooperatives. 850,000 people in the United States are employed by cooperatives, and they have about $3 trillion in assets. Worker cooperatives are a small portion of that. Only a few thousand people at this point are members of worker cooperatives. However, based on experience in Italy, Spain, and other countries, we've seen the ability of worker cooperatives to build wealth. The Mondragon network of worker cooperatives in Spain has 75,000 member owners and has annual revenues in excess of 12 billion euros. And one of the most exciting things is people like Andrew and Hillary who are working to develop co-ops as a strategy for building inclusive economies, especially with communities of color. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Hillary Bell is the leading practitioner of worker co-op development. She's been named in 2014 Echoing Green Fellow, and she's the co-founder of Project Equity, which is a new nonprofit that builds economic resiliency in low-income communities by increasing worker ownership. And Hillary has a long history with worker cooperatives, working for the Equal Exchange Worker Co-op in the 1990s. From 2003 to 2011, she was executive director of Wages, Women's Action to Gain Economic Security, which is now called Prospera, and has led to the development of Latina house cleaning co-ops that employ more than 100 people in the San Francisco Bay Area. She was a consultant for a brief time for the Democracy Collaborative, where I work, both for Evergreen Cooperative Initiative, and wrote a paper called Worker Cooperatives Pathways to Scale that the Democracy Collaborative published last year, and is currently doing some really exciting work with Project Equity, both on development of new co-ops and co-op conversions. Also on our panel is Andrew Diamanti from Buffalo, New York. He's a certified business advisor and social enterprise coordinator at the Small Business Development Center at SUNY Buffalo State. And in particular, Andrew provides specialized counseling services for social entrepreneurs in such fields as business planning, finance, and social impact measurement. Previously, Andrew served as program director for Buffalo First, so has a long affiliation with BALLE, and served on the board of directors of the Nickel City Housing Cooperative. The initiative he's going to be talking about here is to create a development center for worker-owned cooperatives that brings together a coalition of local economy experts, labor organizers, entrepreneurs, community development leaders, traditional economic development agencies, and city government. So I think I want to start with sort of brief introductory comments from, I guess I'll have Hillary go first, and I'll have both of you start with, asking the same question about, talking about your work and just, how do you describe worker co-ops to people who might not be familiar with them?
Okay, thank you, Steve and Leslie. It's great to be here today with everybody. To answer the second question first, Steve, I prefer a very simple definition of cooperatives, which is that their business is owned and controlled by the people who benefit. And in the case of worker cooperatives, it's by the people who work in the business. So essentially what that means is that the workers own the business and that they also have some form of democratic control over the strategic decisions in that business. In terms of Project Equity, I wanted to start with the next slide, actually, by showing this is a paper that Steve mentioned that the Democracy Collaborative published last year. And I had been working in worker co-op development for 8 years when I started working on this paper after I left Wages, and really wanted to step back and think about lessons that we had learned in that organization, interview colleagues across the country who had also learned really important lessons over 20 or more years of worker cooperative development, and to document some of those lessons because there was such a rise in interest in worker co-ops and alternative business forms in the wake of the Great Recession that it felt like some window of opportunity was opening up. A lot of new people were interested or getting involved in the field. And so the purpose with this paper was really to document some of the lessons learned, success factors especially, and then to start to explore opportunities for scale. And it was in that process that I started talking more directly with Allison Lynn Gain, and we thought together about the questions of scale for worker co-ops and decided to found Project Equity. We've been planning it for 2-3 years. We officially launched last April. And we actually decided that we explicitly wanted to ask the question, what can we as an organization founded by 2 people, one with experience in worker co-op development, another with experience in community-based work, but also larger scale social ventures. So Allison has worked in mission-driven companies, private and nonprofit, much larger than I have. So we thought, how can we bring that sort of combined skill set and really make a difference in low-income communities using worker co-ops as a strategy, and also to this movement and this model. So on the next slide, I show you just very briefly what we were thinking about when we got started. We were thinking about the multiple ways that worker-owned businesses could grow. One is that there could be more small worker-owned cooperatives, helping them to start and to grow. There could also be an approach where you try to create and support significantly larger worker cooperatives. So the average number of employees in a worker co-op in this country is 11. At Wages, we were able to build some that had 30 or more worker owners and started to see some economies of scale and more benefits and greater increases in income. And so Allison and I looked at what if we as Project Equity were to focus on starting up larger scale worker co-ops of 50 or more employees. And then we looked at the opportunity to convert existing businesses into worker-owned businesses. And the question was, how can we accelerate growth and have more people be able to have great jobs and ownership opportunities in worker co-ops along any of these pathways? And for our first year, we did 2 feasibility studies on those larger kind of scale strategies, the second 2 pathways here. And we also launched a worker co-op academy together with 2 other organizations here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We had 17 graduate last December. We did follow-on business coaching and legal advice for 4 of them. And we're currently selecting the next cohort to start in August. And this next slide actually shows a brief summary of what our current strategy is, what we're doing. First is continuing the Worker Co-op Academy to support small-scale co-ops. And we've launched a major initiative on worker co-op conversions. So there's 2 parts of that. The first is that we know that most business owners don't know about cooperatives and certainly don't know about worker co-ops as an option or necessarily even about ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, which are more common. So our pipeline development work, and I'll wrap this up pretty quickly, but is to reach out to lots and lots of businesses, help them understand that this option is on the menu, and then explore. And then we're launching a cooperative business incubator in just a few months, in late September of this year, where we will actually provide services to companies, primarily companies that are existing, stable, and of a certain size, and working with low-wage workers, which is our focus, who are making that transition to worker ownership. And finally, we're doing some work around developing ecosystems to support the growth of worker cooperatives, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about those as we go on.
Thank you, Hillary. Andrew, you want to answer sort of the same question and talk about your work?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here, guys. Well, I guess the initial question there about what a worker cooperative is, Hillary handled very well, so I don't have much more to say other than that one worker, one vote concept goes a long way to describing really what it is and what we're all about here. So thank you, Leslie, for switching those slides. But to talk a little bit about our program here in Buffalo, we're developing our working title right now is Work Hive for the project, and it's essentially a worker cooperative business incubator with a geographic area generally limited to the city of Buffalo, and then we're going to focus in on a particular neighborhood where we're hoping to launch this thing. Work Hive is still in the planning phases right now, so y'all are getting a little bit of a sneak peek as to what it's all about. And we're modeling this after one worker cooperative business in particular called Bread Hive. It's a worker cooperative bakery that was started just over a year and a half ago now on the west side in Buffalo, New York. And we're sort of encapsulating their model and really learning from the hurdles that they had to jump over to launch their business and using that as our sort of replicable model for the future. So we sort of took a very analytical approach to their startup process and looked at, okay, where did they go for business development, financial literacy as needed, stuff like that, governance, operations, worker ownership training, which largely for them came from other cooperatives, both nationally and a few locally that had this experience. There's one particular legal expert in Buffalo that specializes in cooperative corporation law, a few accounting services that we have pinpointed, and then we started to look at, okay, where can we get financing from? Bread Hive took a very unconventional and underutilized approach where they held a direct public offering of their shares of the company and were able to start completely debt-free when they launched, which is really exciting. So we also want to highlight that model as potentially something that could be used as we launch these types of businesses. So on the next slide, I just want to briefly mention this concept that Hillary talked about that we're going to revert back to, I think, a lot throughout this discussion, the concept of building an ecosystem for business development, particularly worker cooperative development here. And so this has been part of the planning phase that we've been going through at Work Hive, is really analyzing what are the inputs that are necessary, learning from Bread Hive's model, and then also looking at what we know in the broader spectrum of things as far as business development and as far as community organizing and stuff like that. So we had some key inputs that we wanted to build into this, and then we knew we had some key outputs too. So our awesome, successful worker co-ops customers for those co-ops, and then long-term, as we build a pool of graduates of this program, we can sort of form a federation that can leverage even more power and more clout for these co-ops. So to take a little step back, I should have introduced my background first. So I used to work for our localism organization, Buffalo First, here for a number of years, and now I'm housed at our Small Business Development Center at the SUNY Buffalo State Campus in the city of Buffalo. These SBDCs exist all over the country, usually affiliated with state-run universities. So we provide free business counseling for folks that walk through the door that want to start a business or expand a business that they've had for 20, 30 years. And they tend to be micro businesses, and in some cases, they tend to be good candidates for this sort of thing. I was brought in particularly to do social enterprise work with business owners that were sort of fitting this triple bottom line model. So cooperatives are already walking into our doors, which is really exciting. So we took this concept of the ecosystem, and I'm going to wrap this up because we'll come back to it again during the questions. But on the next slide, I want to show you what this starts to look like when you put it together. Kind of a mouthful, huh? But you can see the worker cooperative there that we're trying to launch and incubate there in the center, with the incubator feeding into it, using some of these top-down pieces of the puzzle, higher ed, like the university where I'm located, government, which has been a really, city government's been really helpful for us here locally, and then sort of traditional financial institutions and how that's going to feed down, and then also we need to loop in existing businesses, other cooperatives in that federation model, and then the community-based organizations like Buffalo First, the localism organization, and like Push Buffalo, which is the organization that's housing our work at the incubator right now, and how we can use their connections to folks on the ground at the grassroots level to really make this model work. So I just want to show the next slide, and then one more. A slightly simplified version of that ecosystem model looks something like this, and these are the pieces of the puzzle that we've been making sure that we've got lined up to successfully launch WorkHive and to make a situation where these worker cooperatives are not only going to be able to be launched, but actually thrive in a broader ecosystem. So we took that replicable model of BreadHive, the community-based organizations, Push and Buffalo First, the technical assistance that we already provide here at the SBDC, and looking to expand into that with more specialized services for worker co-ops. The higher ed component that I'm attached to, the government component, which Harper Bishop, a BALLE local economy fellow, who used to run Buffalo First along with me, is now situated in city government in a way where we can have really great access and really great conversations with city common council members around these topics and how they can support them actively. And then we started lining up some of these financial models, some of the more traditional economic development funding streams, private foundations who are interested in mission-related investments here in Buffalo, which is really exciting. And then direct public offerings, these other models of patient capital that I'm sure Hillary and I will mention again later, to produce this sort of ecosystem that we hope works. So the last slide here just sort of visualizes those different partners that we've brought to the table so far that we feel like position this to be really effective. And the last point I want to leave with here is just sort of underscoring the fact that creating an incubator to crank out worker cooperatives is fantastic work if you're really results oriented, but if you don't have this broader ecosystem in hand, those cooperatives are not necessarily going to thrive. So this is a really important step if you're considering launching a similar initiative in your place. So that's all I've got for right now.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And actually, I think I'm going to go back to you, Andrew, and then I'll ask Hillary to comment on this too. But one of the BALLE organizational principles is that place matters. And so, you know, to give our audience here a sense of the place, you know, what are the neighborhoods you're working in? What are the demographics? Who's coming to you wanting to start co-ops?
Good question. Place is very unique everywhere. So in the city of Buffalo, where we're situated, and Buffalo was recently ranked one of the 4 poorest mid-sized to large metropolitan areas in the country. We've been ranked, I think, recently 6th or 7th on the most segregated city scale, which is a really interesting, challenging endeavor for government and for community organizations to sort of work through. Push Buffalo, which is the organization that's going to be fiscally sponsoring our endeavor as WorkHive, is particularly located in a zip code on the west side of Buffalo that a few years back had the lowest literacy rate of anybody in New York State. And according to some of the numbers that Push has, this west side neighborhood has some of the worst jobless rates in Buffalo, and an average annual income in particular areas of this neighborhood of only $9,000 for the year. This is really interesting, and it really creates a situation where there's a lot that can be done and a lot of opportunity for ownership and empowerment to really take root and have much more of a catalytic impact than if we were to launch this in other communities. So that's where our focus is. Push actually has a great group of folks who have been doing weatherization contracting work as part of their affordable housing project that they've been working on for a number of years. And these weatherization tradespeople have been working toward becoming a worker cooperative, but haven't quite tied the bow on top of the package yet. So we're hoping that they're going to be one of the first co-ops that we can run through our program because they've already got a pretty established foothold as far as customer base and as far as market share in that neighborhood. So we're going to start there. We're obviously looking to impact the city more broadly, and there's certainly a lot of work to be done. It's interesting, we might touch on this a little bit later, how cooperatives tend to be a little bit of a white movement right now. And that wasn't always the case, and particularly in Buffalo, that wasn't always the case. We had a group called the Buffalo Cooperative Economic Society way back in the 1930s that ran through till about the 60s. That was very active in some of the Black communities in Buffalo, putting together cooperatives and worker cooperative models to really uplift a community that was really ignored by the mainstream economic situation. They ran a cooperative grocery for about 20, 30 years over on the east side of Buffalo. And we need to tell that story and be aware that this is something that even if there aren't folks coming to us that fit the model that we really want to go after, it's something where there is a lot of history and a lot of pride, and we can really tap into that and help that as well.
Thanks, and that's a really fascinating story about the grocery co-op you just gave. Maybe we'll have some time at the end to talk about that a little more. Hillary, could you talk a little bit about the communities you're working with? And also, I know that Project Equity has tried to identify priority industries or sectors. So in addition to, demographics, could you say something about, where you see, sectoral opportunity for co-op development?
Sure. So we're based in Oakland, California, and working throughout the Bay Area as our place-based focus, because we do believe that something like an alternative business model that people aren't as familiar with gets great value when existing cooperative businesses can mentor and share their stories and their models with other folks who are getting going or considering that approach. Project Equity also has some work in other parts of the country and is working on some national projects as well. But our focus is here. We're based in Oakland, and just a quick word about Oakland. It's a super interesting city. When I moved here almost 20 years ago, it was had recently moved from being a majority African-American city to being slightly less so, but was one of the most diverse places in the country. Now, of course, we have a crazy tech boom. About 40% of our African-American population here in Oakland has moved out in the last 20 years and gone to live in more affordable suburbs. And the community is really changing quickly, especially in these last couple of years. And, if we could go to the next slide, Leslie, I'll just quickly, this is just one stat, the reason that we feel like worker co-op development is important in this particular community. 45% of people who are working in the East Bay, where Oakland is located, are earning below what's called the basic family wage. So they basically can't afford transportation, healthcare, childcare, all those kind of basics that we need. And the next slide as well talks about the racial wealth gap, which is a big reason that motivates me and Allison to do the work we're doing. The loss of wealth in different communities through the Great Recession, this is nationally, was about 11% for white folks, 31% for Black, and 44% for Latino. And that's because Blacks and Latinos had a lot of their wealth in homes and, of course, were hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis. So I won't dwell on this, but just wanted to share that one data point. And here in Oakland, we see that there's very disparate, documented, what's the word I'm looking for? Inequity, I guess, maybe in what whites are making and Blacks and Latinos are making here. So what we're doing here, the industries that we're thinking about. If we could go to slide 19, I think that's where that is. As I said, like Andrew said, they took a pretty analytical approach to planning their work. We did the same and did actually research a number of industries. Our criteria for choosing them were that they would be industries where there already are good jobs for working class folks, you know, without a lot of formal education or higher education. So manufacturing is one such industry. We also looked at other industries where the job quality might be variable. It might not always be good, but with worker ownership added on, you could have good jobs for folks who, again, are currently in the category of working poor. And our technical term is their other job opportunities are crappy. So I won't go into the details of all the problems with the jobs for low-wage workers in this country, because I think we're probably generally familiar. So we've looked a lot at some green industries, actually, in addition to manufacturing, mostly light manufacturing as well as advanced manufacturing, of which there's quite a bit here locally. Green infrastructure, stormwater management, gray water, rainwater catchment, that kind of thing. Green building services, there's a whole spectrum of things in that category. We also looked at renewable energy. In particular, there's interesting opportunities around LED lighting upgrades with incredible energy efficiency savings. So the time to pay off an investment in something like an LED lighting upgrade for a large institution is actually pretty quick, and then it helps the planet, produces less carbon, and saves people money. We looked a little bit at technology services, and essentially where we're landing for the moment is, if we do a startup business, probably the first one we would consider a larger scale startup would be somewhere in that realm of green construction that could integrate some of these different sub-industries that are described here. We also did industry research as we were studying the opportunity for cooperative conversions, and the 4 industries that showed up in Oakland as having a decent number of successful businesses that employed between 20 and 200 people. That was what we looked at based on our desire to work with larger scale companies in worker ownership. The 4 that came up were manufacturing, healthcare services, commercial printing, and logistics and shipping. We have the Port of Oakland here, which is the 5th largest port in the country, so logistics and shipping is big. So those are ones that we're keeping an eye on as we begin our outreach to existing businesses for our conversions incubator. And the 2 that we think we're going to have some sectoral focus in initially will be manufacturing and solar energy. So we're planning to develop some partnerships with entities working with business networks in those industries to do that education and move people through the pipeline that we'll show you a little bit later of considering and potentially implementing a conversion to employee ownership.
Great, thanks, Hillary. Really interesting stuff, and obviously a lot of potential industries to develop. I think one question I wanted to ask Andrew was about, Andrew, you come out of a small business development center, and I think a lot of folks on this call probably do, we'll call it traditional small business development, with a focus on good jobs and living wage jobs and all of that, but within the standard small business framework. My guess is that there's a fair amount that's actually fairly similar in developing worker cooperative businesses as other small businesses. And Andrew, I was hoping you could talk about what you find to be similar with co-op development and what you're finding to be different.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, the language definitely shifted when I moved from Buffalo First, from our nice little grassroots nonprofit organization into a more sort of institutionalized traditional economic development sphere here at the SBDC, and I sort of represent this interesting bridge between the 2 approaches, which has been a really gratifying and challenging part of my job over the past 2 years here. This comes out of some recent conversations that I've had with some colleagues here. Much like I have the specialty in social enterprise businesses, as far as our counseling here at the SBDC, we also have other advisors that specialize in a variety of things, one of which is restaurants and food businesses. So I have a colleague here who is sort of right along the same timeline as us, working on a food business incubator, food technology incubator. And she's done a lot of really awesome research into the sort of traditional economic development definition of incubation, and we've sort of been able to use some of that great research that she's done to sort of buttress what we're doing with WorkHive. So I bring up this slide here. There's a group called the National Business Incubation Association that tracks business incubators across the country. And they've come up with these 2 principles for successful business incubation, which have sort of become ingrained in the first draft proposals that we put together for WorkHive. First, the incubator aspires to have a positive impact on its community's economic health. I would broaden that definition to just be the community's health by maximizing the success of emerging companies. And then the incubator itself is a dynamic model of a sustainable, efficient business operation itself, which is definitely a lesson that I can bring to the table being a business advisor here at the SBDC. So these are sort of 2 of the sort of keystones that go into it, but what I found really interesting looking at some of these models of existing business incubators across the country and here in New York State specifically is that they're almost always tailored toward technology businesses, light industrial, manufacturing, and applied science kinds of things, and very rarely is it focused on what we would sort of call community businesses. And businesses that have these other sort of underlying things that we're trying to get at with the worker cooperative incubator model. So there's a lot of other things that we want to add to this concept of what we track and what we consider to be a successful incubator. Leslie, I think I have one more slide that talks about metrics, and I just want to bring that up really quickly now. Yeah, speaking the language across sectors. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a number of metrics that the National Business Incubation Association recommends that all business incubators adhere to and track over the course of successful businesses going through the program. So number of clients, number of people employed, monthly salaries, gross revenues for these businesses, and that sort of thing. And then through some of our research putting this together, we were talking to some other existing cooperative incubators, one in New York City in particular, the Center for Family Life Incubator in Sunset Park. And these metrics here on the right, they were generous enough to share with us and with the community. And these get to a little bit more of the community development mindset that sometimes is lacking when we just talk about the traditional economic development mindset. And I just think it's fascinating to put these 2 lists side by side and realize that we're not saying one isn't worth anything at the cost of the other, but rather we've got our work cut out for us because now we're going to be tracking all of these things. So we've got gender, job fulfillment, other work that the worker owners still have to take on to support their families, any barriers to employment that they have, children that they're supporting, and the actual hours that they work is sometimes really crucial. It's one thing to say that you're a worker owner, it's another thing to know how much they're putting in and what that means for the impact on the rest of their lives. So it's an interesting bridge to gap, but I think it's one where it's really worth it to do the homework on both sides. And myself being here, it's been a really gratifying experience to be able to have all of the research at our fingertips.
Thanks, Andrew. And it's nice to see it bring together the community development and the economic development, because it is community economic development, and it really touches into the BALLE themes of people mattering and relationship mattering, and having that be integrated into why we have an economy.
I'd love to add a note there, Steve, if that's okay. At my former organization, we did something that at Project Equity we're hoping to do as well, which was to do significant impact measurement on an annual basis. And at Wages, which is now called Prospera, when I was there, we were able to do that by actually looking and talking with the individual women who were worker owners in these greenhouse cleaning co-ops, using their tax returns, because we helped them find a good tax preparer, and there were reasons why it was easier to access the tax returns, but we got their agreement to that, of course, up front. And we were able to measure individual incomes, total individual income, so hourly and number of hours worked would add up to that, generally speaking, and also household incomes. And what we found that really motivated me to, continue working in this field and to feel like we have to find a way to scale this up was the data that we had. And the latest data point from our Oakland cooperative was that within 1 or 2 years of joining the co-op, the individual members' family incomes had increased by 80%. So I don't know if you've ever had an 80% increase in household income, and not all businesses would do that. It depends on the profit margin and other factors, but that was profoundly transformative for them and their kids and their whole experience. So I'm very passionate about cooperatives measuring, especially when we're in community economic development, measuring impact at that kind of a rigorous level. And you can't always go quite that far, but as a field, in order to make the case for and also know how to do this work really well, we need more data, because there's not a lot out there on the impact of worker co-ops, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with that. Just one of the for a long time, I think you and I and some other folks were kind of in the wilderness, right? Nobody was thinking about worker cooperatives, very few people. So Wages was operating, being very successful, but there weren't a lot of examples like Wages. And now there are a lot more. And I was wondering why you think that is. Why is this idea of using worker cooperatives to build community wealth and equitable development starting to finally take hold?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. Let's see if we could go back to that slide of it looks like the Golden Gate Bridge. I think it's really because of the Great Recession in large part. Not exclusively, but this is from Robert Reich's movie Inequality for All, and it basically shows that inequality peaked in 1928 and 2007, before the Great Depression and before the Great Recession. And the left arrow is not showing where really inequality is going. I think it's probably still going up actually, but you get the idea that inequality is bad for everybody. And I think whether it's Occupy Wall Street or much more mainstream perspectives on what happened in the Great Recession, I think a lot of people are fed up with the current kind of business as usual. So I think that's opened a window for us. If we could go a couple slides down also, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, Steve, but to that benefit slide. Yeah, so this is some of the data that we do have and that I compiled out of my paper, Worker Co-ops Pathways to Scale, that there actually is data, and most people who have new interest in worker co-ops don't know this, so it's not directly causal, but I think the reason why those of us who've looked at it think this is a solution worth scaling up is because it is clear that on average, worker co-ops do provide better income and asset building and better jobs for employees. So things like Cooperative Home Care Associates, the largest co-op in the country, with 23 or 2,500 employees, has 15% turnover for home care workers, an industry that has 40 to 60%. So that alone is a quality job factor that's major, and at least a quality care also. So the people, the elderly and disabled folks who are getting care from those individuals are getting a much better deal. And I won't go through all of this, but there is new evidence. I just want to highlight the first bullet under the businesses section there. The Democracy at Work Institute, in their most recent State of the Sector study, actually got some new data, I think for the first time, showing that in industries for which they could find a cluster of worker cooperatives and then comparable industry data, that the worker co-ops were between 2 and 6% more profitable than their peers. So there actually is also evidence from that data point and then from the ESOP world and from other kinds of co-ops that cooperation, employee engagement, sharing ownership, those actually do lead to better companies. And to some degree, there's an argument to be made to better democratic participation in society in general and to better health and social outcomes as well.
Great, thanks, Hillary. And Andrew, I'll just follow up with that question, a slightly different tack. I mean, you're working, in a small business development center, and you're working with city government, and these aren't the usual suspects of folks that would be developing employee-owned cooperatives. So what are your partners seeing in this effort?
Not the usual suspects at all. I think it's great. So as far as, great slide to jump back to. As far as our connection with the city, I want to zero in on that a little bit more in particular, because this is not an easy one, and it definitely depends on your place and depends on the politics of the sort of power hierarchy that you've got to play with in your place. But the sort of tack we've taken with it is city governments are always going to respond to effective solutions that really improve city conditions or work to solve really systemic problems in that city or in that municipality. So we've sort of framed our language when it comes to worker cooperatives and it comes to what WorkHive is doing in a way where it's easily digestible for the folks holding power. So we worked effectively with a few common council members to get a resolution sponsored and passed in support of worker cooperative development, particularly as it can be an effective solution toward alleviating poverty, dealing with these sort of chronically low-wage service sector jobs that have expanded to Buffalo, much like they've expanded in most other city areas. And as a way to sort of address this income inequality thing, which is something that with our highly segregated city, It's also highly segregated along wealth lines as well, and so it's a very real issue for us. So you put it in that sort of framework, and then all of a sudden people listen. And we also found one other little tidbit when it comes to working with municipal government would definitely be start small. You know, give them something very digestible. Our Common Council members here in Buffalo seemed really ready to support efforts that are going to directly affect their constituencies. They represent particular neighborhoods across the city. And so you really want to target folks that have these pressing issues in their community, ask them for whether it's just the support of their name in writing or whether it's the support of a few $1,000s to run a feasibility study locally for what you're doing and build off the progress from there. So we found it to be a really rewarding process, but definitely it depends on who's in the room. It definitely depends on finding the most progressive electeds in the room and then going to them first. And but luckily for us in Buffalo, it gained some traction. We've got some great models to follow. I mean, this isn't an idea that we invented, right? So we're in the worker cooperative world. There's a lot of attention being paid to New York City's city government allocating $1.2 million out of the city capital budget for worker cooperatives, and then Madison, Wisconsin is hopefully doing a similar thing too. So, you know, we're using a model that seems to be working right now. Again, given this national inequality conversation that seems to be picking up steam.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And actually, I don't know if folks know this, but New York City, that was the first year they did 1.2 million, and they just passed the budget for the coming fiscal year at 2.1 million. So obviously a positive sign that the amount went up and went up by such a substantial margin. So they do seem to be seeing results there. Hillary, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the idea of conversions, and why would a business want to convert to a worker cooperative, and what's the advantage of that approach? And maybe say a little bit about what are some of the steps that would be required to convert an existing business to employee ownership.
Yeah, and Leslie, let's go up to slide 10 actually for the direct answer to Steve's question, and we'll come back to this one. Sorry, slight digression, but this was my fault. First of all, why do conversions matter? One is that many of today's worker co-ops have been formed through conversions of existing successful businesses, but also because thousands of businesses are changing hands right now, and $1 trillion of business value because of the great tsunami of baby boomers retiring. So it's something like 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day, and they own more than half of businesses that employ people in this country. So a lot of those could sell to a corporate buyer who will close it down and just kind of take the assets or the customer list of the business, or if they do keep running it, often there's massive layoffs in a takeover transition like that. Or it could close down, because most family businesses, just as an example, only 15% of them have a successor in the next generation. So that's the why it's important. But to answer your question, Steve, about why a business owner looking at his or her own business, on the next slide, we've got a real concrete answer to that. Sorry, the one after that. Yeah, sorry, I keep digressing. I didn't order my slides quite right. This, I just wanted people to know that some of what I'll be talking about here, including the answer to Steve's question, is in this publication that Project Equity put out in April with a dozen case studies of businesses of a wide range of sizes who have converted to become worker co-ops. And from those case studies, we drew out business motivations and a typology and readiness factors. So the next slide is that motivation. So, first and foremost, I think the most common motivation is that a business owner usually wants to leave a legacy, and they feel that their business is part of that. And many small business owners are really passionate about the people who work for them or who work with them, and about the communities that they work in. With all the people retiring that I just talked about, the baby boomers especially, people do need an exit strategy. And as I mentioned, from a local business owner perspective, a lot of their options are not always actually great ones. So first and foremost, an exit strategy. Secondarily, we do see a lot of people who they may not have thought of it that way originally, but when they learn about it or start to think about it more, sharing ownership with employees as a natural extension of their mission. And that's especially true, I think, of companies that think of themselves as mission-driven, whether it's for environmental or social reasons. But it's also true of a lot of companies who just are like good local community-based businesses. You do have some who are passionate about the issues we're talking about today, about building wealth for employees in low-wage sectors. And then I already mentioned there is some evidence that shows that employee-owned businesses actually do better as businesses, and that they have more resiliency and longevity. So I think when business owners understand that, it makes it more appealing.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hillary. Andrew, I thought I'd ask you, I know you said you wanted to talk a little bit more about building the ecosystem, and could you give a little bit of, sort of your picture of where the Buffalo ecosystem is now, and maybe where it's going to be in a few years?
Sure. Yeah, so if we could jump back to those ecosystem slides. Let's jump 2 more forward. Yeah, I want to start here. So we took the approach here, again, as I said earlier, that this is going to be a joint effort, and it's going to extend far beyond the walls of the incubator itself. And we really needed to balance these concepts of knowing that some of the most effective and quickest and best financed ways to do this were unfortunately more top-down models, or working with government officials to release funds for this, or working with some of the traditional economic development financial institutions to cordon off funds, particularly for this sort of development. But we also needed to work on the ground with people, with real businesses, which is where we really spent some time focusing on which community-based organizations we could best align with. Push Buffalo, as I mentioned, seems the most natural fit for their focus on social enterprise. The fact that they're already working on putting together one worker cooperative business, and for the fact that they were particularly in the West Side neighborhood that we wanted to hit hardest when it came to this. And then we needed to couple that with the sort of traditional economic development pieces that I was bringing to the table through the SBDC and through higher ed. And we also wanted to look at this ecosystem not as a static thing where we could launch a couple more worker cooperatives off of this, but also really look at what we can do down the road, 5 years, 10 years down the road, as this scales up and as we hopefully end up with a federation of worker cooperatives here, similar to the number of businesses in New York City and other places. And to do that, we needed to start looking at procurement and policy issues. So some of our work with the city government hasn't just been, will you allocate funds for worker cooperatives? It's also, how can we change the mindset where you can also become a customer of the worker cooperative through municipal procurement. We're also having those conversations with higher ed institutions like SUNY Buffalo State, where I'm located, because they're going to be big pieces of that customer pie for these worker cooperatives that are coming out. So, and again, this is an oversimplification, obviously, of all the connectivity that occurs in an ecosystem like this, and maybe if Hillary's got some time, she can talk about her ecosystem model too, because I think it's great.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And Leslie, I'm going to ask you if there are any questions. I can't see them on my screen, so you may have to read questions to me if they exist.
Okay, yes, we do have some questions. We have one from someone who's curious about the funding streams for incubators. So kind of what are the streams typically? I think you were kind of getting into this, Andrew, but local government, philanthropy, and what percentage do each of these streams represent for incubators that you know about?
Should I tackle that first? I'm happy to touch on it quickly. Yeah, so how do you fund this work? Very, very creatively. That's my short answer. You got to look at what's there in your place again. So we're lucky that we've got a few foundations, a community foundation and a private foundation, who are very interested in shifting some of their endowment money into mission-related investments. So we have local money that's potentially going to fund part of this project, and more importantly, fund these worker cooperatives once they launch. We've also received a little bit of support from city government through the heavy work and conversations we've been having with them, and that's really just, meeting people and talking to them and opening their eyes up to something that they kind of know about but don't quite know about. And then we're also obviously looking nationally, because there are groups all over North America that specifically are out there looking to fund more cooperative development. So that's my quick answer.
Great. Are there more questions, Leslie? I suspect there probably are.
Yeah, Hillary, did you want to answer that?
Only just to say that, yes, in our case, our incubator currently and our Worker Co-op Academy are primarily philanthropically funded through grants, but we do have an earned income strategy. So I think for anyone who's nonprofit or grant funded, it's important to see how you can maximize that. So for example, we're charging the teams more to participate in this year's Worker Co-op Academy than we did last year, and giving them some help in crowdfunding to raise that money if they don't have it. So with any cooperative, whether it's the buy-in amount that you put in as a member or whether it's, some program you might participate in to get support, we don't want finances to be a barrier, but in reality, they're actually not. I think if you have, things like payroll deduction for worker owners, you don't have to have, $400 to join a co-op up front. If your co-op sets up payroll deduction so you can pay it in, and similarly for our programs, although we are going to be charging the businesses that participate, if that's a barrier for them, we help them find creative ways to address it.
Great.
Sorry, one more thought. There's a really interesting study, if folks are interested, that I could pass along on incubators. I'm not sure if it's the same one Andrew mentioned, but it did show that the ones that were nonprofit funded versus for-profit incubators were significantly more successful than the for-profits, and that was a government study, U.S. government, I can't remember which department. So very interesting to just consider.
Thank you. That is interesting. We do have another question, Steve, that I'll go ahead and throw out. So we have another guest who was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the governance and decision-making frameworks within cooperatives. Are there, and also if there are different models that the audience can take a look at.
Yeah.
And I'll put that outside for you.
I'd be happy to jump in, and Andrew, please feel free to add. The second part of the question is really great because, yes, there are absolutely different models, probably as many as there are co-ops, to be honest. And that's one barrier in some ways, is that there isn't sort of one where when you say I'm going to be a worker co-op, it's obvious how you would do something as complex as governance. But many co-ops have actually created their governance models based off of another cooperative, so you can always have something to start with. The spectrum, I would say, ranges from what I would call collectives, which are usually very flat, non-hierarchical, and often make decisions by consensus. Not all of them do. That said, only some co-ops are set up that way, and many are not. And some of the ones that are not have really creative hybrid models. Some have fairly traditional management models with a sort of representative democracy governance structure, which essentially means that the worker owners elect the majority of the board members, and the board would make kind of policy and governance type of decisions. And there's always then an annual general assembly of all the worker owners, and there can be other ways that the full body of worker owners participate. But in terms of thinking about scale and community benefit, I personally always encourage people to consider all of the range of options, including ones that would have some hierarchy, because what we found at Wages in particular was that by having the full group of worker owners have a more limited set of decisions they needed to make, they could make those really well, and you could design really good processes of, different touch points where people can engage and proposals can be developed through the worker owner participation and then either approved by the board or approved by the worker owners or both. But I found that was more empowering with the low-income workers that I work with at Wages than the collective model where everybody got to and had to, and often it was actually a burden of having to make sort of all decisions all the time together. Some co-ops make that work really well, so I'm not saying don't do it that way. I'm just saying there is a whole range of options that are worth considering.
Great. So I'll jump in with a question here, maybe for Andrew, since Andrew, you used to work at BALLE, a localist business alliance organization. What are, in terms of policy, since there are folks on the call who do policy work, what could be done? Now, one thing obviously is providing money for technical assistance, but are there other steps that could be taken by BALLE affiliated chapters that might actually move the ball in terms of making worker cooperative development easier?
The list is as long as we have time for, Steve. We experienced one really interesting legislative pitch when Bread Hive, our worker cooperative bakery, was starting out, and it was a weird glitch in the way workers' compensation law works here in New York State that proved to be a huge barrier for them. They were going to be paying a ridiculously high workers' compensation bill, even though as employees they really weren't going to be making much in their first couple of years of business. But it just really wasn't structured for a situation where there were going to be that many owners of the business who were also employees. So that's been something that locally we've been looking to change, and we wouldn't have known until we got into this particular situation with a particular type of business, a bakery. Likewise, I mean, there's a whole list, and I'm going to borrow heavily from the work that the New York City Federation of Network of Worker Cooperatives has been putting together some guidelines, but there's all sorts of things from inclusion of worker cooperative businesses and other social enterprises here. I mean, there's a lot that could be done in government small business assistance programs, similar to the SBDCs here, including MWBE certifications, new tax designations, incentivizing democratic firms to retain earnings, incentivizing conversions, finding really financially easier models for existing baby boomers to sell their businesses to their workers, and then really looking at things like procurement and stuff like that, and actually talking about procurement set-asides for democratic firms. So there's a whole host of things that certainly we could spend some time on policy-wise.
Great. Hillary, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was great.
Okay. Leslie, are there more questions from the audience?
I did think of one thing, which is that in any of our organizing or advocacy, whether it's toward government or mobilizing other people around it, I do think it's important to consider sort of the supply side of co-op development, meaning like who's going to actually build the businesses. So, you know, some people say the ecosystem follows the entrepreneurs. It's not that the entrepreneurs follow the ecosystem. So somewhere in here, we need to have worker co-ops getting going. So if you don't have developers or co-ops that are starting, one of the early initiatives, I think, whether through government or elsewhere, would be to find funding to fund co-op developers that can help them get going.
I'll second that.
Great. Let's see. I'm trying to see if there. Leslie, are there any other questions that are from the audience that I should ask?
I think we have time for one more question from you, Steve.
One more question from me. All right. Well, maybe talk a little bit about sort of the steps for the nuts and bolts steps that are necessary for engaging this work. So if somebody wanted to set up a co-op incubator or academy in their city, what are some of the action steps that would need to take place? And I'll throw that to Hillary first.
Okay. Yeah, great question. I would think about what are the success factors. So obviously there's an educational component of any program like that. So how do you get good business education? And actually here in our Worker Co-op Academy, and I know the Green Worker Co-op Academy in the Bronx, which has been around a number of years, there's been a really good partnership with a nonprofit business education organization. And you want to educate them about co-ops as well, but you want to get really quality business education in there. And also, of course, the democratic governance and the workplace participation and what is a co-op anyway, all that kind of stuff. What we did at the Worker Co-op Academy here was we also made sure that we had business coaching as a supplement and also legal advice. And so the partners who got together to do this are two legally oriented nonprofits that provide direct legal representation, and my group, Project Equity, which is focused on the holistic, all of the pieces of co-op development, but also kind of that business part. So we provided that extra business coaching. So I would say figuring out what the components of success are, and then who can provide those and how you piece those together into a good program, and then of course how you fund it.
Hey, thanks, Hillary. Andrew, anything you want to add?
Well, I think Hillary was already echoing my sentiment. It's the ecosystem, making sure you've got all of these components in place to make sure that this is a successful environment for a worker cooperative business to exist once you incubate it. And I think playing off of the really strong components that are already there, that are maybe nearly serving our needs, but not quite. And I look at the example of me coming to the Small Business Development Center here in Buffalo, cooperatives, benefit corporations. These options aren't even on the list on some of the literature here. And so I've been spending time just adding it to the list, you know, when it comes to what are your legal incorporation options as a business. If we're not presenting it as an option at these already funded business development institutions, we're missing a whole big demographic right off the bat. So some of the basic stuff like that comes into play too.
Great, and I think I need to throw this to Leslie at this point. to wrap up the webinar. Is that correct, Leslie?
Sounds great. So great conversation. Learned a lot from you all today. Thank you so much for all of your insight and expertise and work that you're doing in this field. We are going to continue on in a conversation with you all for our champion member benefits, an extra 30 minutes to have a direct conversation with you. And for everyone, we want to thank you for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the topic as well. We will be sending you links to the slides that you saw today, as well as the video recording and audio recordings for the webinar, so you can go back and make some further notes. And we also want to invite you to go to our website if you want to check out some of the other conversations that we've been having this year around the 8 solutions of what's working to build thriving local economies. So thank you so much. We'll invite the general public to go ahead and leave the event room, and we'll transition on into the champion benefit session. And we'll just give that about 1 minute, Steve, and then pick back up.
Okay, sounds great. And thanks everyone for participating in this event.
Thank you.